La emisión está comenzando. Todos los asistentes están en modo de solo escucha.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to greet you and to welcome you on behalf of the NBSAP Forum to this first webinar of Part 2 of the Introduction to Resilience for Development MOOC, Applying Resilience Thinking to National Biodiversity Plans, offered by the United Nations Development Program. My name is Marcela Torres, and I'm a consultant on sustainable development and green economy. I am also your facilitator throughout the entire course. For those participants who joined us for Part 1, please note that we are extending the deadline for the completion of the required course components. If you complete the 6 online lessons, test, and survey by 12 February, you will still be able to receive the certificate of completion signed by Achim Steiner, Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, Cristina Pasca Palmer, Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and Johan Rockstrom, Director of the Stockholm Resilience Center. If you're just joining us for Part 2, we look forward to starting with you. For Part 2, you will be required to complete the 3 online lessons, the course test, and the course survey by 12 February to receive the certificate of completion. We are grateful for your participation in this first webinar titled Delivering on Global Biodiversity-related Agreements, Using NBSAPs to Translate Global Ambition to National Action, which will be presented by Tristan Terrell. Tristan Terrell is a program officer at SwedBio at Stockholm Resilience Center. Tristan's work focuses primarily on biodiversity, ecosystem services, and resilience, particularly examining ecosystem-based solutions to climate change and sustainable development. This includes tracking and contributing to international policy-related processes such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the Sustainable Development Goals, among others. He also facilitates work with key partners to foster capacity development, such as through multi-stakeholder dialogue seminars. He holds a Master of Science in Conservation Biology from the University of Kent, United Kingdom, and a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Science from Trinity College, University of Dublin, Ireland. In this webinar, Tristan will briefly describe how the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011-2020 has formed a global framework around which most countries have developed or revised NBSAPs. While primarily linked to the implementation of the Convention of Biological Diversity, the Strategic Plan was envisaged as a common approach for all biodiversity-related conventions and elements that have been incorporated into the recent Sustainable Development Goals. Using examples from recently revised NBSAPs, this webinar will explore the extent to which countries have used this common framework approach and how it has translated to effective action towards successful and resilient outcomes. Welcome, Tristan, and thank you for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Marcella, for that introduction, and good morning, everyone.
Thank you. Just very shortly, before we begin, I would like to remind all of you of some rules and dynamics in the NBSAP Forum webinar sessions. Microphones will be muted during the presentation. This reduces interferences and facilitates communication. We will have a 30-minute presentation followed by 30 minutes of questions and answers. Please send us in advance your questions or raise your hand in the control panel of GoToWebinar. If you want to speak and the connection allows it, I will open your microphones during the Q&A session. This session is being recorded and it will be available on the NBSAP Forum website, www.nbsapforum.net. All participants will receive an email with a link to watch it, as well as a PDF copy of the presentation and a list of resources related to the topic. Now I will transfer the webinar to Tristan. We hope you enjoyed the session.
Thank you very much, Marcella. Good morning, everyone, again. I'm going to talk very briefly about the thinking behind the strategic plan for biodiversity 2011 to 2020 and how NBSAPs fit within that as the national implementation mechanism under the convention, but then also how using NBSAPs allows for thinking across, not just for the CBD, but also for the other biodiversity-related multilateral environmental agreements, as well as other related agreements, including the Paris Agreement on climate change and, of course, the SDGs. I hope everyone can hear me okay and can see the presentation on the screen. So, the strategic plan, oh, excuse me. There we go. The strategic plan for biodiversity 2011 to 2020 was agreed in 2010 at the 10th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which was held in Japan that year. Very importantly, it is the strategic plan for biodiversity and not the strategic plan for the Convention on Biological Diversity, or in any way, what they've tried to do is keep the association of the strategic plan broader than just the CBD. The intention being that it was a common framework, that it is a common framework for countries, parties to the convention, but also parties to other conventions, biodiversity-related MEAs, as well as other stakeholders such as NGOs and civil society, to use it as a common strategy and a common focus to allow for cohesive and coherent action on in addressing the decline in biodiversity. One of the main things about it was that it was, while it was certainly for the conservation of species and habitats, etc., it was also about trying to frame the role of biodiversity and resilient ecosystems and the services that they provide in underpinning sustainable development. And so the mission included recognition of its role in contributing to human well-being and to poverty eradication. Very briefly, the structure of it, it has 20 global targets, known as the Aichi targets, grouped within 5 strategic goals. And these goals are based around the DIPSIR framework, as it's known, Drivers, Pressures, State, Impact, Response framework. So strategic goal A was about addressing the underlying causes of biodiversity mainstreaming, and that includes things like raising awareness and recognizing the value of biodiversity. Direct pressures, things like habitat change and invasive alien species, etc. C, directly safeguarding ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity. That is very much about the core idea of addressing maintaining and improving the status of biodiversity. D is recognizing the benefits to ourselves. So that is where the ecosystem services element comes in. And then finally, goal E is about enhancing implementation, and it's some of the underlying management responses, including participation, knowledge management, capacity building, etc. And then the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. I'm not going to go into these, but hopefully people are fairly familiar with them. This was the decision that was taken in 2010. I'm not going to go into the text in depth, but just some key points to recognize. The decision called for participation from all levels and from all sectors in both the development of national planning for implementation of the strategic plan, but then also its actual implementation in the longer term. So it was to recognize the role of women, indigenous peoples, local communities, civil society, private sector, and other areas of government, not just the more standard Ministry of Environment or what have you. It asked for the development of national and regional targets based on the global strategic plan and the global Aichi targets, but that were relevant to the national context. That the these plans, these NBSAPs, would be revised as appropriate, reviewed and revised as appropriate, essentially developing a national coherent plan for what countries were going to do at the national level. And not just at the national level, it was also recognizing subnationally what the roles would be for various sectors within the country. The integration of these targets into national development planning, to poverty reduction policies and strategies, national accounting, etc. That very much the concept of mainstreaming, how to integrate biodiversity into these other sectors in order to recognize the value of biodiversity and ecosystem services and to ensure that it is fully recognized. Monitoring and reviewing the implementation, have an adaptive management approach at the national level, and then finally recognizing that there are synergies among the biodiversity-related conventions. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just about implementing for the CBD, but also recognizing its relevance to the other biodiversity-related MEAs. And as mentioned already, it's about recognizing how biodiversity underpins ecosystem functioning, and through that then the provision of ecosystem services for our benefit. Within the conservation community, there are certainly people who are far more interested in ensuring conservation of biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, and others are perhaps a bit more utilitarian and recognizing that it is very much for to ensure our economic development, for reducing poverty, for ensuring health, etc., etc. And the CBD recognizes this through its three pillars. One is the conservation of species and habitats. Second is sustainable use. And then the third is the equitable sharing of the benefits. And so the strategic plan very much tried to I suppose, tick off all three of those three pillars. The NBSAPs themselves have been the implementation mechanism of the CBD right from the start. It is Article 6 of the original convention text. And there have been NBSAPs right from the 90s or early 2000s. As documents, they are supposed to be inclusive, integrated, have a plan for implementation, and to be coherent. Well, obviously coherent in the sense that they make sense, but also coherent in the sense that they are in line with other national priorities, and that could be development or health or whatever the case may be. And then Decision 10.2 in Japan in 2010 called for countries to revise their NBSAPs to set national targets based around the new strategic plan and the IET targets. And the idea is that the NBSAPs themselves are supposed to link, be a common point around which the implementation or the role of biodiversity and ecosystem services is recognized for multiple objectives, and also for use by multiple sectors. So it's about linking to the MEAs, in particular the biodiversity-related MEAs, linking to development, recognizing, although this was slightly later in 2015, recognizing how they fit within the SDGs, but before that the Millennium Development Goals, climate change, poverty eradication, etc. Linking to some of the other sectors that perhaps have potentially have a negative impact on biodiversity, agriculture, fisheries, etc., but also those that would benefit most from it, including potentially tourism, etc. And recognizing the role of various groups within the country. And then also as a common framework for support from regional or international organizations, but not just at the national level, but also at subnational level and recognizing where they would fit at the local level. In 2005, there was a review done on the previous generation of NBSAPs, the ones that before 2010 and the new strategic plan. And it was noted that while these were supposedly the implementation mechanism at the national level, there were some quite large gaps within them. For instance, not many of them had SMART targets. SMART is specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time. I can't remember exactly. Time, but basically that they have a fixed target. So by 2020, for instance, or by 2030. And a lot of them were fairly nebulous. That they would a lot of the targets set at the national level were nebulous in the sense that they didn't have a clear. It wasn't clear what they were trying to achieve by when and also how. And they were also very much focused on biodiversity, as in species conservation or habitats, but didn't necessarily recognize the role of ecosystem services quite to the same extent. They didn't necessarily have implementation plans. What was the role of other stakeholders other than just the Ministry for Environment, for instance? And recognizing how the various stakeholders fitted into this, into the implementation of the plan. They didn't address some of the underlying causes. Didn't recognize, for example, the economic value or the role of negative incentives. Mainstreaming biodiversity into other national planning did not feature particularly highly. The use of biodiversity indicators, appropriate biodiversity indicators, was not necessarily always there. Biodiversity financing was largely overlooked within the plans. Similarly, communication strategies and technology needs and capacity building were also lacking. So the idea is that the NBSAPs themselves should be the common framework for which to achieve not just the CBD, but also the biodiversity-related MEAs, recognizing how the other biodiversity-related MEAs, such as the Convention on Migratory Species, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the International Plant Treaty, and the World Heritage Convention, all have a role, perhaps a more specific role within the conservation of biodiversity, and that it is not just about the CBD trying to necessarily achieve all objectives, but also recognizing that there are challenges for at the national level in terms of trying to implement and successfully implement all of these biodiversity-related MEAs. So the idea of the NBSAP is that inclusive and coherent framework in which various biodiversity-related targets and objectives can be achieved, and it's looking at the role of these other biodiversity MEAs as well as the other sectoral plans and priorities all fit within this. And so there is at the international level, there is a biodiversity liaison group, which allows these 6 biodiversity-related conventions to meet on a reasonably regular basis to talk about how, at least at the international level, there is some sort of coherence between them, and that the support or demands that they put on parties, on countries that are signed up to those conventions, can actually be streamlined and supportive. And the need to synergize then across through using NBSAPs, for instance, is recognizing that the more biodiversity-related MEAs that exist, the more obligations there are on parties, which themselves have a cost and efficiency implications. So it's allowing for more streamlined use of capacity in various forms at the national level. There are overlapping issues. Within the CBD, there is a focus on, for instance, inland waters, which then also has a commonality with the Ramsar Convention, for instance. The World Heritage Convention and its focus on protected areas, as well as Ramsar, also links to some of the work being done at the CBD. So it's recognizing these overlapping issues and allows for more coherent implementation of the three to avoid replication. And finally, that no single body alone can address these challenges. Biodiversity ecosystem services are highly complex systems that have to be managed using a number of key stakeholders, both within the environmental field as well as outside of it. So it's recognizing the role of all those various stakeholders, and therefore hopefully leading to greater impact. Outside the biodiversity-related conventions, there is, of course, links to the other two Rio conventions, the UNFCCC Framework Convention on Climate Change and UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and both recognise the role of natural systems in order to achieve their own targets. Under UNFCCC, there is an objective towards land degradation neutrality, which obviously has a strong environmental component. Under UNFCCC, the role of natural systems has been there to a certain extent, but is only relatively recently that the role of ecosystems in supporting the mitigation and adaptation to climate change has really come to the fore. The Paris Agreement, which came out in 2015, does recognise the role of forest carbon stocks in particular as a means for carbon sinks to help mitigate against climate change. And this is not necessarily surprising given a lot of the work that had been going on in the build-up in the previous years leading up to Paris. But it does also recognise the role of the sustainable management of ecosystems in general, although it perhaps focuses a bit too much on forests relative to other ecosystem types. But at least there is a recognition of the role of nature within the agreement. And there has been work recently on recognizing all natural ecosystems, or perhaps not all, but a number of natural ecosystems for when countries are looking at developing their own national approaches through NDCs or what have you, trying to achieve or support the achievement of the Paris Agreement. And then again in 2015, there were the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is a broad framework trying to address sustainable development along a number of avenues. And the role of nature again is fairly well recognized within it. In the chapeau to the text, it does recognize that nature supports the achievement of sustainable development. And then there are a number of, I suppose, biodiversity-related or environment-related goals, such as, in particular, 14 and 15, which is life below water and life on land, but also, for instance, 6 on clean water. And 13 on climate. And there has been a number of studies that have tried to actually empirically show the role of biodiversity as underpinning the successful achievement of all the SDGs. The conservation community is certainly standing up and trying to be quite vocal about the need to recognize biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of the means to achieve all 17 SDGs, 169 targets. And the issue is that similar enough to with the strategic plan for biodiversity 2011 to 2020, that while the conservation community is out there talking about the need to recognize biodiversity ecosystem services as underpinning a number of these other large social issues being faced, there is an issue with the ability to demonstrate the value of biodiversity ecosystem services in that sense. And so a number of people have tried to do studies emphasizing the role of biodiversity within this. This was a paper that we did a couple of years ago, towards the end of 2016, that tried to look at the degree to which the Aichi targets and the SDGs were mutually supportive, with some degree of overlap, but with a number of gaps within it. And the idea was behind that was thinking about, well, after 2020, when there is a new strategic plan being discussed through the CBD, how do we try to ensure that the work of the CBD also supports the achievement, the implementation towards the achievement of the SDGs, and to start thinking about, well, there are certainly gaps within the Aichi target framework, and using the SDGs, then trying to recognize how do we use the CBD in order to fill those gaps, and a large part of those gaps were about the recognition of the underlying ecosystem function as a way of then providing those ecosystem services which would themselves support the achievement of the SDGs. This is just a list of some of the gaps that were identified, such as safe ecological limits. We don't, within the SDGs, there is talk about sustainable consumption and production, but it doesn't necessarily understand where that safe operating space might be. There is talk about pollution, but not necessarily, again, linked to ecosystem health, for instance. Culturally important species are not considered the more sort of economically important species excuse me, within the SDGs. The role of indigenous peoples and local communities is not fully recognized. And the role of ecosystems as carbon sinks within the SDGs are not necessarily all that well recognized. There were a number of other studies that have been done as well, some showing the strength of the role of biodiversity within achieving the SDGs, etc. And this is then translated into, well, what does that mean in terms of national implementation, and what is the role for NBSAPs? This graph on the left was a study and analysis that was done by UNDP that started to look at the actions that were identified within NBSAPs and to what extent they link up with the SDGs. And it showed that there was a fair amount of useful action being undertaken through the NBSAPs that would help to support the implementation of the SDGs, but obviously it's not universal. And so there needs to be greater recognition of, at the national level, of how biodiversity fits into sustainable development planning in order to really emphasize to other stakeholders the need to recognize the role of biodiversity in ecosystems. Some examples then of national coordination. There are a number of ways that the countries have tried to look at being synergistic and complementary at the national level. And there are various forms in which that has been done. These are two national committees that have been formed, one in Cameroon and the other in the UAE. The one in Cameroon is more, I'm not going to say ad hoc, but it is a looser group. It hasn't got the same mandate necessarily, but just that the Minister of Environment invites other ministerial departments to come together to discuss planning and review implementation. Whereas in the UAE, there is a ministerial decree that requires other ministries and other entities to come together to actually undertake this exercise, or these exercises. The degree to which they are effective is harder to judge, and that, I suppose, will be seen when we start coming to the end of the 2020 period. At least in terms of raising awareness and hopefully raising recognition of the value of biodiversity ecosystem services is increased through this approach, so long as the role and value to those other ministries and those other sectors is well expressed at the national level. A couple of other examples about recognizing in the NBSAPs how the national targets fit within the broader, the global frameworks. So both Belize and Ireland have tried to identify where their national targets fit within either the Aichi targets or the SDGs, or both. And this process at least allows for when the person who is responsible, or the team that are responsible for implementing the NBSAPs at the national level, go off and start talking to the other ministries and the other sectors, who themselves are potentially looking at the SDGs and seeing where they fit into that. They can identify commonalities within their own work. Just one other final example that I haven't got here as a slide. It's a fairly well used one now at this stage, but Bhutan has got this gross national happiness framework, and has a policy review process that ensures, or tries to ensure, that policies being developed in any sector try to achieve a number of national priorities, and the environment is very strong within that. So at least it's a legally recognized and quite a strong national policy review process. Again, the degree of effectiveness has yet to be fully identified, although at least with Bhutan, there are some quite strong hints that it is quite an effective approach. But of course, it's not necessarily one that every country can replicate. I understand that this PowerPoint will be shared with the participants. Here's just a list of some useful resources for people to go off and do some further reading if they wish. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Tristan. This is a really interesting and relevant topic for our NBSAP forum members. I'm sure our participants found your presentation valuable for implementing their NBSAPs in their own countries. I would like to invite participants to share their questions, doubts, and comments, or raise their hands to participate in the Q&A session. Please use the control panel of the GoToWebinar platform. I can open your microphone or read your question, depending on your preference. So while these questions start coming in, Tristan, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the gaps you found between the IT targets and the SDGs, and has there been any discussion of how these gaps can be filled before the 2020 deadline, for example? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Actually, that's a very useful question. One of the things that we also, with that study, tried to emphasize was it wasn't just about thinking post-2020, for current implementation of the strategic plan, or implementation of the current strategic plan, and how countries were and are thinking about how they will implement the SDGs at the national level, to recognize that that there are these gaps that do need to be considered both in both frameworks, frankly. What we have been doing is talking with a number of others about some of the work that they are doing, also looking at these the opportunities as well as the shortcomings in potentially using the SDG framework as a means to support biodiversity and ecosystem services conservation, but also vice versa, and how the CBD framework can support the implementation of the SDGs. And there are a number of studies going on that are looking at that, and also looking at specific areas rather than necessarily just the whole framework, but also going down and looking specifically at the role of protected areas, for instance, or the role of invasives, or the role of climate change. The CBD has just put out a suggestion for a process for developing the new strategic plan, which will include a series of regional consultations. It's yet to be decided whether or not the post-2020 framework will, to what extent it'll be in line with the SDGs. I'd say it's fairly likely that it will be quite closely aligned, but at least it will allow for a fairly in-depth review of those synergies as well as gaps between the two frameworks.
Thank you very much. We have a question coming in from Mercy Gloria Ashepet. I hope I pronounced it correctly. She says, I'm a student whose interest lies in human-wildlife conflicts. How can such studies be integrated into biodiversity strategic plans?
That's a great question. One of the challenges that I think one of the big challenges that we're facing is just that as human populations increase and we spread out, we're moving further and further into what will be natural habitat for species, which leads to increasing human-wildlife conflict. In a past life, I've worked in a couple of places that really we're trying to address the human-wildlife conflict situation in order to focus on certain species conservation. So, for instance, in Cambodia, I was working on a human-elephant conflict project. The problem was that I suppose the driver behind it was that into elephant habitats, their sort of migratory paths, and the elephants themselves, being intelligent, were recognizing that the farmers' fields were an easier source of food. But of course, the farmers, being subsistence farmers, didn't appreciate that, and so were looking at how to eradicate elephants. And the problem is, how do you actually address that in a way that allows the farmers to have their livelihoods, but also encourages the elephants to not raid their crops. Ultimately, you have to. It does have to be at the national level. You do have to recognise some of these conflicts through national policies, in particular through the NBSAPs. And there are various schemes within that, but if you think about it from a point of view of the Aichi targets, you're talking about awareness raising, capacity building, positive incentives, financial incentives, effective habitat management, habitat restoration, the effective management of protected areas, for instance. There are a number of ways that addressing human wildlife conflict can feature within what will be fairly universal sections within or targets, I suppose, within national biodiversity planning. The problem is more about just recognizing what can be a very local problem and bringing it up to the national level. And that's one of the reasons why effective consultation with all stakeholders, both in the development or the revision of the NBSAP, but also in its implementation, is very important. And that's unfortunately, well, I'm not going to say that. Unfortunately, to a certain extent, in that it's the people who, or sometimes even the person who is responsible for implementing the NBSAP has got a huge workload and would not necessarily be in a position or perhaps have the energy to go off and carry out continual consultations. And so it's as much about the individuals themselves, whether they are at university or if they are in NGOs or local communities or whatever, to make sure that they are stepping forward and saying, you know, don't forget me, don't forget us.
Thank you, Tristan. We have somebody raising their hand. Julie Mulonga, I will open the microphone for you right now. Hi, Julie, can you hear us? Hello, Julie. Julie, I think we have a connection problem. Okay, we'll go on with another question. Anushrida Sivanandan says, my office is working with local organic farmers to participate in bird-friendly farming practices and to brand the product as bird-friendly. For poor farmers, economic sustainability is very important. Otherwise, they cannot cooperate. How can this be addressed?
That's a very good question, and unfortunately not an easy one to answer. The recognizing the role of local communities, local approaches in the broader scheme of things across the country has been a frustration for a long time for a large number of people. With just coming back to NBSAPs, one of the big drivers for biodiversity loss has traditionally been the rise of modern industrial agriculture. But of course, that has huge economic impact on for national economies, etc. And therefore has been the driving force behind a lot of the work that is being undertaken by the Ministry of Agriculture, etc. The NBSAPs themselves do recognize the impact of this on biodiversity and ecosystems, and therefore have been trying to address those drivers. And hopefully, in order to do that, they have been talking to the Ministry of Agriculture and perhaps some of the unions and some of the others behind this push for more industrial forms of agriculture. I suppose in an ideal world, there are three ways of trying to address this. One is talking to the NBSAP implementation people to make sure that there is a recognition of these more ecologically sensitive forms of agriculture as a means to supporting the achievement of the targets within the NBSAP. Talking within the agricultural community to make sure that there is increased recognition of the role of these forms of agriculture. And that could also be consumer bodies, not just the producers. But the third thing is that you can't necessarily do this on your own as an individual farmer or an individual community. There has to be a recognition across, and presumably it's not just in one area, that there are a broad range of people who are undertaking this type of agriculture or similar, and that forming an association or some sort of a body to act as a sort of a lobby group to then talk to the government either at the regional level or the national level is the best way to do it. It's easy to say. There are, of course, challenges in terms of how do you actually form this body? How do you recognize each other? How do you have the money to go off to go to the capital city to try and talk to the various people or what have you. It's certainly not straightforward, but there is certainly a need for it. And of course, you also need to be able to show that there is evidence that supports how this form of agriculture can be good, not just for biodiversity and conservation, but also for people's health and well-being, as well as the livelihoods of the farmers and the farmer communities themselves.
Thank you, Tristan. We have another question. He says, hello, Danan from Iraq. Studying in Brussels, Master in Biodiversity. Thanks, Tristan, for your presentation. Most local people are poor and they need to survive, and they can't really think about the sustainability of their agriculture. So I think it's difficult to deal with them. How do you deal with them, and what are the lessons learned from your experience? I think it's a bit similar to the previous questions, but could you address this more directly, please?
Sure. Where to start? Local communities, indigenous peoples and local communities themselves have struggled for a long time, but in terms of trying to secure their own livelihoods when being faced by a number of challenges from outside communities. And this could be access to clean and sustainable water to help for their agricultural practices, but also just for their own personal use. Then accessing markets in a way that they would actually receive a fair price for their goods, etc. And it's an ongoing problem, so it's obviously not an easy one to fix. What we have been doing at SWED Bio is trying to support the ability of these communities to come together, to share knowledge and experience, and then to have a collective voice when talking to the national government, or perhaps at sort of UN level fora. And so on the website there, www.swed.bio, you'll find we have an approach called the multiple evidence base, as well as the dialogue approach, which allows communities and various stakeholders to come together to talk in a relaxed and hopefully non-judgmental space to talk about what are the challenges that they are facing, and then try and find some of the solutions, common solutions, in order to overcome them. The multiple evidence-based approach is about how you can use traditional knowledge in combination with more sort of academic knowledge forms, as well as grey literature and some of the less academically scientific approaches, to come together, to bring them all together, to therefore set policies, or to come up with a common approach, or just to recognize the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities using their own knowledge and practices in a way to achieve broader policy outcomes. And obviously, given that our focus is largely on biodiversity ecosystem services, we've been using it as trying to raise awareness and recognition of the role of traditional knowledge and practices in biodiversity conservation. But it could certainly be potentially also used when it comes to agriculture and agricultural, the role of local subsistence farming practices in agriculture as well.
Thank you, Tristan. I just saw somebody else with a question. Christopher Amanda. He says, I wanted to ask about urbanization and biodiversity management. In most developing countries, there is growing urbanization, and this has affected conservation of biodiversity around urban areas, mainly exacerbated by poverty levels. Based on your experience, how can we conserve these areas which are heavily under threat due to urbanization?
None of these questions are very easy, are they?
No, they're not. We have a very high-level audience with very interesting questions.
Absolutely. So again, unfortunately, if this was an easy issue, it would already be solved. You're absolutely right. With the influx, the in-migration of people to urban areas has obviously put a lot of pressure on natural resources in and around those areas, whether it's water or forests, and even animal and plant species that people are taking for food or what have you. Ultimately, the responsibility would have to fall on the municipal governments to recognize that there are going to be these people coming in, and to try and have spaces that are systems in place that would allow for these new immigrants to be able to set themselves up in a way that doesn't require them to then go off and have to build their homes when they arrive, to then go off and cut down more wood for firewood so that they can cook, etc., etc. Systems for waste collection in all its various forms, and that again is easier said than done. There are also systems in place in some areas looking at awareness raising and trying to educate both the people coming in, but also the people already there, on the sustainable use of natural resources in order to ensure that there is as little environmental degradation as possible resulting from this sort of increased urbanization. There's one project actually. Also, I suggest going to swed.bio, the website. There have been some efforts to try and work with local governments in a number of African countries to think about spatial planning around river systems. It's called the Una Rivers Project, and that's very much about trying to take a sort of a top-down approach to addressing some of these issues, recognizing that there will be continued immigration of people into urban areas, and therefore to try and plan for it. Within NBSAPs, there should also be recognition of this. The extent to which it has been addressed within NBSAPs is very varied. Some of it has been focusing more on the increased urbanization as a driver for bushmeat demand, and thinking about it more from that perspective rather than necessarily just focusing on habitat conservation or even restoration in and around urban areas. But it's an area that has been insufficiently addressed, I think, by the conservation community to date. I think, perhaps getting better now, but certainly it has been overlooked in the past.
Thank you, Tristan. Speaking about things that are going better and that are improving, on the slide you showed about the NBSAPs and post 2020, we can see that it seems that development planning is highly addressed in the NBSAPs that were reviewed. Is there improvement in introducing biodiversity into development planning overall? How do you interpret this? Hello?
Sorry about that. Still on mute. Did you mean this slide?
Right. It seems that development planning is quite significantly considered in the NBSAPs that were reviewed, or am I mistaken?
No, I think you're absolutely right. Most countries have, through their NBSAPs, have tried to recognize the role of biodiversity and ecosystem services in underpinning various aspects relating to development. And largely because, well, for a couple of reasons. One was the call in 2010 to get countries to recognize that biodiversity is important for these other things, but also that countries recognize it as a means to raising awareness and having increased attention and action for conservation purposes by bringing in the link to broader societal challenges, whether it's poverty eradication or health or clean water or whatever. The extent to which that has happened, I think, is a bit more varied. As I said, there has been increased recognition of the role of some ecosystems in adapting and mitigating climate change, for instance, but that has largely been, relative attention is a lot smaller to, say, technological solutions. Similarly, within the clean water argument, the relative use of natural systems as a means of having sustainable clean water coming into urban areas is still relatively small compared to the use of technological solutions. Again, the increased recognition of the role of ecosystems in terms of disaster risk reduction is increasing, but it is still less than perhaps would be ideal. But perhaps it's because when people are building some technological solution, for instance, a concrete wall, a seawall or something against storm surges coming off an ocean, there is something there, and within a couple of months it's built and people feel safe behind it. Whereas if you're taking a natural solution, it takes longer for that system to develop to the extent that, if you're starting from scratch, certainly, that people would feel that this is safe. Not necessarily thinking about how in 20 or 30 years' time, that natural solution is probably the more sustainable in the longer term and the more cost-effective way of doing it, as opposed to building a seawall that in 20 years' time has been eroded back, or it turns out it's too low and has to be increased or something. And so the use of some of these other sustainable development arguments within NBSAPs has certainly helped to raise the profile of the NBSAPs, but with perhaps less success than we would like. But hopefully it's moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Tristan. That's very interesting, and you touch on a very important topic, that is how much people rely on technology and science to solve many of these problems. I think this is a relevant issue that arises every now and then. Well, they'll come up with a solution. The scientists will figure it out, or the technologists. So Thank you for your answer. We have another question, and this is also an interesting topic, which brings about a lot of debate. It says, regarding the balancing of cultural practices and the introduction of innovation to indigenous communities, we have been experiencing loss of resources due to the inability of the communities to accept sustainable practices taught to them. Is it more economical and even friendlier to offset the community's impacts to other areas, or is there a better alternative? So this poses an interesting question between reducing or offsetting, basically.
Sorry, Marcela, could you just repeat the question?
Yes, the person is asking of how to balance the cultural practices and the introduction of innovation to indigenous communities, because they have been experiencing loss of resources due to the inability of the communities to accept sustainable practices taught to them. So the person, he asks, is it more economical and environmentally friendlier to offset the community's impacts to other areas, or is there a better alternative? So if the communities are not accepting sustainable practices, and their traditional practices are not sustainable, should they be offset in some way, or is there another way to make them be more sustainable? It's a tricky question.
It is. So I'm not sure what is meant by offsetting their impacts into other areas. I know there are biodiversity offsets that are used in the private sector, for instance, and a company would go off and would restore a habitat either adjacent or further away from where they're working, and that would allow them to carry on their practices on their main practices in their land. I'm not entirely sure how indigenous or local communities would do the same, given that they probably don't have the money to go off and buy other land. So I'm not entirely sure who would do the offsetting. But it is a very tricky question in the sense that well, it's certainly true that some practices can be unsustainable by everyone, but it's also true to say that there are some practices that are traditional practices by Indigenous peoples and local communities that are more sustainable than perhaps more modern approaches. So again, the question would be who's deciding if something is unsustainable. I think to answer this question, really need to have a couple of examples. In terms of raising, sort of educating or raising awareness of these unsustainable practices, I think the education the educational approach needs to be very sensitively handled, and not that the alternative approach that is being suggested is, say, inappropriate for the culture and traditions of those particular communities. Historically, there have been quite a lot of examples of people coming into these sorts of communities with supposedly better approaches that have been very inappropriate for those areas. So again, I would just bring up the use of the dialogue approach that allows for the community members, these others who might be government or NGOs or civil society or academia or whomever it is, to come in and to sit down in a circle or whatever, and to talk about some of these issues, to look at what evidence there is to show that these practices might be unsustainable, and then to think of ways there would be alternative approaches or alternative livelihoods that could allow for the communities themselves to not be alienated from their own cultures in a way that would be mutually acceptable to all. But unfortunately, without more specifics on what this person was thinking behind the question, yeah, I hope that's good enough.
Right. Thank you so much, Tristan. Well, we have reached our allotted time. So many thanks again, Tristan, for your time and the willingness to answer all of the questions. And thank you all for your participation in this webinar. Tristan, could you please share with us your final remarks on the topic or any recommendations you may have for our participants today?
Sure. So the main point really is that countries at the national level can go off and carry out a consultative process to develop an NBSAP or whatever the policy document is. But for the purpose of today's discussion, focusing on NBSAPs, it's all fine. They bring together academia, NGOs, different government ministries, maybe representatives from those indigenous peoples and local communities to come together and to decide on these national targets and national indicators and national implementation plans. And then it all gets finalized and signed off. And the problem is then the implementation of it. And it's really about ensuring that that consultation and that sense of community when developing or revising the strategy then also gets carried on into the implementation, and recognizing that everyone has a role, and to be able to continue to have a voice within the management of that document. And sometimes that does not happen for various reasons. As I mentioned before, it could be just the person responsible is overworked. It could be owing to a lack of adequate financial resources to bring people together. It could be technological problems. It could be differences in the actual how to implement on the ground ends up causing factions. But irrespective of that, there is a need to carry on this discussion to make sure that all are involved at all levels, not just at the national level, not just in the capital cities, but right the way down to those local communities. As that person was asking earlier about local level agricultural systems, there is a need for those people to be able to have a voice throughout the life of the NBSAP. And that is a responsibility certainly for the person or the team who is implementing the NBSAP, but also for the individuals to make sure that that they are trying to make their voice heard. So my recommendation is that people are aware of what their national and maybe even local policies are in relation to biodiversity and ecosystem services, and to make sure that they are not just knowledgeable, but also making the effort to have their voice heard. Although perhaps they might be a bit short and grumpy or whatever, a lot of the people who are the national focal point or the NBSAP technical officer or whomever, they are just human beings. So don't be afraid to send them an email or pick up the phone and try to call them to make sure that people's voice is being heard, and to find out what is happening in terms of implementing the NBSAP and to what extent there is adaptive management, etc. That's right. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Tristan. This has been a very interesting webinar. I just have a few other things to say to our participants, some reminders. So please check out our website, www.nbsapforum.net to get the latest news regarding this webinar and the Introduction to Resilience for Development MOOC. There you will also find a PDF copy of this presentation and a link to the recording, which will be available on our YouTube channel. For further information, please visit the NBSAP forum or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Also, please remember to register and update your profile. The NBSAP Forum is a global partnership to support the development and implementation of effective national biodiversity strategies and action plans, NBSAPs. It is hosted by the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Development Program, and the United Nations Environment Program. My name is Marcela Torres, and on behalf of the NBSAP Forum, I hope you all enjoyed this session. Have a great day or evening. See you next week.